Hey guys, welcome to this devlog for Covenant of Roses, my turn-based tactical deck builder. I'm going to show you some changes I've made to my user interface and how that affects the balance of my game, my process for designing these UI elements, a couple new enemies that I've implemented, and share a design problem I'd like your feedback on. So first, the UI. I've eliminated a lot of the clutter. You'll see that I change this pretty much on a fairly frequent basis. And you can see that most of the confusion is gone now. Now there's only going to be an AP counter for action points and a health counter for how much HP you have left. I was using health bars before because I thought they looked cool, but I realized they don't really make too much sense for this sort of game. A subtlety that I didn't notice when I was starting out programming this was the magnitude of health and, general stats that everything has in my game. I know that in some games, like Destiny for example, everything is just really scaled up. Like bosses have maybe 100,000 health or 4 health bars stacked on top of each other. And this doesn't mean necessarily that they take a ton of time to kill. Perhaps your weapons do 100 health, so it's only 10 shots. So then what's the point of having scaled up everything by 100 times? Why not just divide all the numbers for health and damage by 100? Well, there are a couple of benefits to having large numbers. The main one that comes to mind is that you have a lot more fine-grained control. If you want to balance a game by nudging the amount of damage a player does by, say 1%, you can imagine that's easier to do if the weapons already do 1,000 damage each. But if they only do 1 damage each, that nudge of 1% turns that into 1.01, and then it kinda just looks messy. This also has its drawbacks. It does tempt you to try to balance things very, very precisely in ways that probably the player will not even notice, and having numbers that vary so minutely or are really large or small in terms of order of magnitude, it becomes kind of difficult for the player to understand what's going on. Like, it's hard to visualize what a million is or a billion, and if you have that many health points, it sort of loses meaning. So the tack I've taken is to reduce the total amount of health and damage output just by a factor of 10. And so now the player is going to have maybe around 10 to 15 hearts, and the enemies will have a similarly scaled amount of health. This method definitely makes it a lot less complex for me to just nudge around values and see what changes, and it can make smaller numbers seem more powerful. I personally prefer these numbers to be a lot simpler. I don't personally think it's super fun to do lots of mental math to calculate how much damage you did exactly or what that number means, and if you like those sort of games, well, I guess you can look elsewhere. I've also changed the damage text a little bit, and you'll notice it's a lot more prominent now. I've just added an outline and made it disappear a lot slower, so now you can actually read it instead of having it disappear in your peripheral vision. If you're interested in learning how to make these UI damage pop-ups yourself, I've found a simple way to do it, and I have a tutorial on it, which is in the upper right corner. You'll also notice a new little debug console that prints data directly to the screen. But why exactly do I need this if the Unity editor already comes with a console? Well, when you're testing a build, you probably won't have access to that console, so it's great to print data out on the screen, and as a bonus, I think it looks pretty cool. The architecture is pretty simple. I just write to a array of strings, and then I just pop off the top 8 entries from that string and print it to the screen in this standard UI text box. This idea was taken from The Witcher, which also has the UI console that shows you things that happen when you're in combat, so I thought it'd be useful. Alright, so on to the general UI process that I promised at the start of this video. So this is going to take a more holistic approach than my other video about pixel art UI. So the first tip is to start with context. I like to use the whole scene, just taking a screenshot and put it in the background of a frame. You don't need to worry exactly about the resolution, but try to make it close to what you think is reasonable. You'll want to leave buffers and free space around everything. Make sure that you have the same amount of space from the edge to each of your UI elements if you can. And a cool thing that I just noticed is that Aseprite has these pixel coordinates and size data in the status bar in the bottom of the screen. You'll also want to try to make the shapes a bit similar, just to have their silhouettes to be of a similar form. There's an easy way to create a cool drop shadow by just using the outline tool. If you hit Ctrl-O and you select only the pixels in a particular direction to add a drop shadow, it'll sort of outline them in a very easy way. You'll want to definitely use layers to create a wireframe, to check the positioning with simple silhouette elements, and then you can start adding detail and experiment on further frames. And most importantly, make sure to iterate on your UI design like I have been doing, since I've changed my UI pretty much at every video that I've made so far. Okay, so in terms of monsters, I've added in FSMs, AI, for 2 more monsters. There's one for the big cactus enemy, which I'm going to call Prickles, and this thing which I might call Card Thief, or something like that. So the idea for these 2 enemies is that the cactus, it tries to get to the center of the map, and it sends out a radial line of attacks if the enemy goes anywhere along the same row or column. So, like, if you imagine chess, this thing is pretty much like a rook. So this piercing attack is going to cut through everything in between it and the player, which is also going to damage enemies, and something added is that if you step in line with it, it won't attack you immediately on the next turn where you step into it. Rather, it's going to attack 1 turn after that, so it'll pause for a second, and then it will sort of get ready for an attack, and then it will launch it 2 turns after you step in line with it. I think this adds a lot of interesting depth to the game. So you're going to be able to sort of bait these cactus towers in order to attack enemies between you and it, or you could even stand between 2 of them if they're aligned along an axis and make them attack each other. And I think this is really cool. I like games where you can make enemies attack each other and where you don't actually have to do anything. You just need to position yourself cleverly and bait the enemies into attacking each other. Now, the Card Thief enemy is pretty unique amongst the other ones I've added. It's going to interact with the card system in a way that no other enemies do. Basically, it's going to have 3 phases. In the first phase, it's going to walk up to you and it's just going to follow you until it gets adjacent to you or it dies. And if it spends 1 turn next to you, it's going to steal a card right out of your hand. Once it does that, it's going to start making a beeline for the edge of the map. And once it gets to the edge of the map, it's going to go into the 3rd phase, where it's trying to escape. So it's just going to stay still during this phase and become quite vulnerable, where you can probably one-shot it. If it stays in this phase for long enough, it'll just disappear and take your card with it. Now, my idea here is that if you let it steal a card from you, and then you kill it after it does that, it will both give you that card back and a bonus card at the end of the level. So it creates an interesting risk and reward choice. Do you just kill it immediately and eliminate the threat, or do you let it steal a card, potentially become a little bit weaker, and then try to kill it and potentially get some more bonus, or maybe you'll just lose that card permanently. I hope that I can find more of these sorts of interesting trade-offs, and more generally, I think forcing the player into making these complex decisions is really the core of this game. Finally, I want to talk about the efficiency problem. So something that's bugged me for a while is that players don't really have an incentive to finish a level quickly. Since I've made it so that enemies can't really move and attack you on the same turn, you could theoretically just dodge them forever and never take any damage, or just wait until you get the perfect hand. You can imagine that this strategy is pretty boring, so I want to incentivize completing a level in as few turns as possible. Now, the main benefit of this is that I think it's a lot more fun. It incentivizes creativity and making solutions that get rid of or attack a bunch of enemies at once, rather than dodging them and taking them on one at a time. One interesting perspective for game design is that of incentives. So how do you get the player to do what you want as a designer? Broadly, you can punish them for doing something you don't want them to do and reward them for taking an action you want them to, sort of the carrot and stick model. And of course you can combine those two. So how do we apply this to this design problem of trying to force a player to be efficient? Some games punish you, like the original Rogue, which has a food bar. So if you don't keep moving, you're just going to starve to death, and that would be a punishment system. So this method directly punishes you for staying in a level for too long. Risk of Rain does something a little bit more subtle, where the longer you stay in a level in order to grind resources and gear, the more difficult the level gets, and the more difficult the rest of the game gets, where difficulty basically scales in proportion to the time you've spent playing. An example of the opposite is the combo meter. So a combo meter will incentivize doing a lot of attacks to a lot of enemies at the same time, and it'll also incentivize finishing a level quickly. And so that's an example of a positive and negative reinforcement. I'm trying to figure out a good way to include something like this in my game. Some ideas I've had so far are level effects, where one level has a sort of hazard, like lava, that spreads more and more as time goes on. So if you take too many turns, the floor is just going to turn into lava and you'll die pretty quickly. I could also give a bonus card if you finish a level early, but I think that seems a little bit too gamey and a bit abstract. I could add maybe a fatigue stat that over time just decreases your AP or handicaps you, so if you play too long it'll just get harder and harder. Alternatively, I could continuously spawn enemies over time, or create variants of the enemies and let them evolve over time so they do more damage or do different types of damage to you rather than staying static. If you've got any interesting ideas, I'd love to hear that, so leave those in the comments. Alright, so if you want to keep on following Covenant of Roses, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to my channel and also join the Discord if you want to chat there. I'll leave a link in the description. Otherwise, have a nice day, and I'll see you in a month.